I'm Mason Whitaker. I'm 39 years old, and I work as a senior compliance auditor in Raleigh, North Carolina, which means I make a living evaluating risk, identifying inconsistencies, and reading the subtle shifts in tone and body language that tell you when someone believes their own narrative a little too strongly. My wife, Lauren, who is 34, has always been more spontaneous than I am, more socially fluid, and recently she found herself deeply immersed in a new circle of friends from a CrossFit gym. 3 women named Tiffany Reynolds, Amber Collins, and Jenna Morales, all of whom radiated the kind of high-energy confidence that comes from curated Instagram feeds and relentless self-validation. They had known Lauren for barely 3 months, yet they carried themselves in my home that Thursday night in late February, as though they had been appointed guardians of her emotional well-being. We were seated around our dining table in our Five Points house, the one with the restored hardwood floors and the big windows facing the street, and I had just finished pouring wine when Tiffany cleared her throat in a way that felt rehearsed, as if she had practiced the timing in her car beforehand. The 3 of them exchanged quick glances, subtle nods that suggested alignment, and then Amber leaned forward with a smile that was meant to look friendly, but carried an edge of challenge. They announced what they called a 48-hour loyalty challenge, explaining in confident, almost performative tones that too many husbands cheat, too many women are blindsided, and Lauren deserved proof that I was not one of those men. The words were wrapped in concern, but the undertone was accusation built on assumption rather than evidence. I watched Lauren carefully as they spoke, noticing the faint tension in her shoulders and the way she kept adjusting her napkin, caught between amusement and discomfort. I did not interrupt them. I let them finish their carefully coordinated explanation, which involved staged social media interactions, planted scenarios, and deliberate attempts to tempt me, as though fidelity were something that could be stress-tested like a defective appliance. The entire proposition was delivered with a tone of righteousness, as if they were performing a public service, and I could almost see the narrative they had constructed in advance, the story where they would either expose a flaw or confirm their own cynicism. When they finally paused, clearly expecting outrage or defensiveness, I responded calmly, because calmness unsettles people who anticipate resistance. I told them that if this was something Lauren genuinely wanted, I had nothing to hide and no reason to refuse. I made it clear that my commitment to my wife was not situational or dependent on surveillance. At the same time, I added, in the same even tone I use when presenting audit findings to executives twice my salary, that if they intended to evaluate me, I would be evaluating them as well. I explained that tests reveal more about the people designing them than the subjects taking them, and that any orchestrated deception, no matter how justified it feels, says something about trust, boundaries, and character. The effect was immediate. The smiles that had been bright and triumphant tightened at the corners. Tiffany's posture shifted back slightly. Jenna's confident expression flickered into something more cautious. Amber forced a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. They had expected compliance or anger, not parody. In that moment, the dynamic shifted from a group of women staging a clever intervention to a room of adults suddenly aware that scrutiny runs both ways. I remained composed, finished my wine, and observed the subtle recalibration happening around the table, fully aware that the next 48 hours would not only test loyalty, but expose motives that had little to do with protecting my marriage. The first setup unfolded less than 12 hours after their dramatic announcement, and it carried the same theatrical precision I had already begun to expect from Tiffany in particular, because she seemed to enjoy orchestrating moments where she believed she controlled the narrative. Friday morning, I received a text from an unknown number containing nothing more than a time and a location: Skyhouse Kitchen, a trendy rooftop cafe downtown that prides itself on panoramic views and overpriced lattes served in minimalist ceramic cups. There was no greeting, no explanation, just coordinates presented as if I were being summoned to something clandestine, and the very simplicity of the message confirmed that this was the opening move of their so-called loyalty challenge. I arrived 20 minutes early, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, because I prefer to observe before I am observed. From the parking garage, I took the elevator up and positioned myself near the corner of the rooftop where the glass railing overlooked the skyline, giving me a clear view of the entrance without drawing attention. The morning crowd consisted mostly of young professionals tapping at laptops, and a few couples taking carefully staged photos against the city backdrop. Within minutes, I saw Tiffany step out of the elevator, dressed in fitted athleisure that projected casual confidence, scanning the space with the alertness of someone coordinating logistics. A few feet from the entrance stood a young brunette in her early 20s, styled deliberately but subtly, the kind of appearance crafted to seem effortless. I watched as Tiffany approached her, exchanged a brief smile, and discreetly handed her a folded stack of cash. The brunette glanced down at it quickly before sliding it into her purse. Even from a distance, the thickness of the bills was obvious, and later when I reviewed the zoomed images on my phone, I counted enough visible edges to reasonably estimate around $250. The honey trap was not sophisticated. It relied on the assumption that I would walk in blind, be flattered by attention, and behave in a way that validated their suspicions. Instead of approaching the bar where the brunette positioned herself with calculated nonchalance, I remained seated at a small two-person table I had chosen specifically because it faced both the entrance and the seating area. When Tiffany finally noticed me, the flicker of surprise in her expression was immediate and unguarded. I stood, walked calmly toward her, and before she could speak, I took out my phone and showed her the timestamp photos I had just taken of the cash exchange, including one clear frame of the bills mid-transfer. I did not raise my voice or accuse her of anything. I simply stated that orchestrated temptation is rarely as discreet as people imagine, and that transparency is a powerful thing when documented in real time. Her posture stiffened, and I could see her mind recalculating. I then shifted the conversation, mentioning that while she had been concerned about my integrity, patterns are often more revealing when examined objectively. I referenced her frequent early morning spin classes that coincided almost perfectly with the publicly advertised training sessions of a 27-year-old personal trainer named Derek Lawson, whose social media posts were meticulously time-stamped. I added that in my profession, I often review publicly available records, and that it had not been difficult to locate court documents from her previous divorce that included a quiet $38,000 repayment settlement, details that suggested financial entanglements she had chosen not to discuss publicly. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The confident smirk dissolved. The color drained slightly from her face. The self-assured cadence in her voice faltered as she attempted to pivot from confrontation to dismissal. The honey trap dissolved in the space of a few sentences, not because I raised my volume, but because I demonstrated that scrutiny is reciprocal. In less than 5 minutes, the woman who had arrived believing she controlled the test understood that control is an illusion when the other party refuses to play the role assigned to him. When I returned home from Sky House Kitchen, the atmosphere inside our house felt heavier than when I had left, and Lauren was sitting at the kitchen island with her phone in her hand and an expression that I can only describe as stunned clarity, the kind that comes when denial finally dissolves. She told me she had accidentally received screenshots from a private group chat because one of them had forwarded the wrong image in a rush, and what she saw was not concern for a marriage, but ridicule. They mocked her for being gullible, joked about how easy it would be to prove men are all the same, and treated the entire situation like entertainment rather than something that could destabilize a relationship. The tone in those messages was not protective. It was predatory, built on superiority and the thrill of catching someone in a failure they had already decided existed. That afternoon, they escalated again, refusing to retreat despite the morning's collapse. Another anonymous text arrived with a location: Brookfield Nature Reserve, a sprawling area of wooded trails and open fields where joggers and dog walkers move in predictable patterns. This time, Lauren insisted on coming with me, not to spy, but to witness. We parked near the gravel lot overlooking the main trailhead, and I told her to remain in the car so she could observe without being drawn into whatever performance they had arranged. Within minutes, I noticed Amber positioned near a shaded bench, pretending to stretch while scanning the path with an intensity that betrayed anticipation. A man I had never seen before began jogging toward me at a slightly erratic pace, glancing over his shoulder as if waiting for a cue. As we approached each other on a narrow section of trail, he deliberately veered off his line, colliding into me with exaggerated force and immediately launching into an overly flirtatious apology that felt scripted down to the cadence of his voice. I steadied myself, took a step back, and declined the invitation embedded in his tone without irritation or engagement. I wished him a good run and continued walking, refusing to participate in the artificial tension they had engineered. Then I turned, not toward the jogger, but toward Amber, who had frozen mid-stretch when she realized the scene was not unfolding as planned. I walked directly to her and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear, explaining that staged accidents are rarely convincing when the participants lack discipline. I told her that while she had invested energy into testing my restraint, patterns of financial behavior are far more revealing than staged flirtations. I referenced specific figures: $29,500 in documented online betting losses accumulated across several offshore platforms over the past 18 months, and I mentioned the nearly emptied $40,000 college savings account that had been established for her 12-year-old son. I noted that the withdrawal dates aligned precisely with spikes in betting activity and that the sequence created a timeline too clean to dismiss as coincidence. I did not accuse her of malice, only of recklessness, and I made it clear that information leaves traces, especially when conducted through digital channels that create permanent records. Her composure disintegrated in seconds. The forced athletic confidence evaporated, replaced by visible panic, and then something closer to shame. Her eyes welled, her shoulders sagged, and the defensive posture she had carried all afternoon collapsed inward. She attempted to deny it at first, but the dates I recited anchored the truth in a way that left little room for performance. From the car, Lauren watched the entire exchange, not with triumph, but with a dawning realization that the women who claimed to protect her had built their authority on foundations far less stable than they pretended. That evening they sent a group message insisting on one final meeting, the tone no longer playful or smug but sharp and urgent, and the location they chose was an old brick tavern downtown called the Red Stein, a dimly lit place with heavy wooden tables, exposed beams darkened by decades of smoke, and amber light that makes everyone look slightly more dramatic than they are. I arrived precisely on time and found the three of them already seated in a corner booth, their drinks barely touched, their posture stiff in a way that betrayed the strain beneath their attempt at composure. Tiffany's earlier bravado was gone, Amber avoided eye contact entirely, and Jenna, who had been the quietest throughout the week, now carried herself with forced defiance, as if she had decided the best defense was outright dismissal. They opened with accusations framed as moral outrage, claiming I had overstepped, that I had invaded privacy, that I had turned their harmless test into something aggressive and disproportionate. I listened without interrupting, noting how often they glanced at one another for reassurance. Jenna finally leaned forward and declared that unlike the others, I had nothing on her, that she lived clean, that whatever I thought I had discovered was either fabricated or irrelevant. The confidence in her voice was deliberate, rehearsed, almost desperate. I reached into my briefcase and removed a slim folder containing printed documentation, because physical paper has a gravity that digital screens do not. I laid the pages on the table one by one in deliberate order, aligning the corners neatly. The first set detailed prescriptions written by 3 different physicians over the same monthly cycle, each for identical anti-anxiety medication at overlapping dosages, totaling 180 pills per month. The second set showed pharmacy fill dates that coincided precisely with those prescriptions, leaving no ambiguity about volume. The final stack consisted of over 110 peer-to-peer payment confirmations, each averaging around $60, sent from accounts clearly associated with college-age individuals, many of whom use university email addresses or profile photos that made their demographic obvious. I spoke calmly, explaining that overlapping prescriptions from multiple providers raise flags within state monitoring systems, and that the pattern of incoming payments suggested redistribution rather than personal use. I referenced publicly accessible notices from the state medical board indicating preliminary investigations into several of the prescribing physicians, investigations triggered by irregular prescribing volumes and cross-reporting algorithms. I did not accuse her of crimes. I simply described the alignment of data points and how easily such patterns draw institutional attention once they become visible. The effect was immediate and visceral. The color drained from Jenna's face so quickly it seemed to leave her physically unsteady. Her jaw tightened, then trembled slightly as she scanned the documents, recognizing her own name, the dates, the figures she clearly had not expected to see compiled so coherently. Tiffany and Amber shifted in their seats, no longer posturing, no longer attempting to steer the conversation. The air at the table felt dense, heavy with the realization that the narrative they had tried to construct about me had inverted completely. I gathered the pages back into a neat stack and slid them into the folder without flourish. I told them I had no interest in public humiliation, no desire to escalate anything beyond what had already occurred. I gave them one simple condition delivered without threat or theatrics. They were to walk away from our lives permanently. No contact, no indirect messaging, no social media commentary, no attempts to reinsert themselves into Lauren's orbit under any pretense. I set a midnight deadline for confirmation, not because I enjoy ultimatums, but because ambiguity invites negotiation, and I had no intention of negotiating boundaries. I finished my drink, stood, and left them in the dim amber light of the Red Stein, fully aware that control in that moment belonged to the person who had nothing left to prove. They refused, and the refusal arrived 8 minutes before midnight in the form of a message from Tiffany that read with forced defiance, claiming this was not finished, and implying that I had made a mistake underestimating them, as though escalation were a contest rather than a chain reaction. I had anticipated that possibility, not because I am vindictive, but because in my profession contingency planning is not paranoia, it is procedure. Earlier that evening, after leaving the Redstein, I had finalized a set of automated evidence disclosures constructed entirely from strictly verifiable public information, court records, regulatory notices, prescription monitoring data summaries, civil filings, and documented financial transactions that required no interpretation beyond simple chronology and arithmetic. I did not embellish a single detail, did not speculate, did not accuse, did not attach commentary that could be framed as harassment. I compiled facts and organized them into coherent timelines with citations, clearly labeled and sources linked or attached, as publicly accessible documentation. The system was simple and time-delayed, triggered only if no confirmation of compliance was received by midnight. At 12:01 a.m., after Tiffany's message made their refusal explicit, the disclosures were transmitted automatically to relevant recipients, spouses whose names were already listed in public filings, and regulatory boards whose oversight responsibilities were triggered by documented irregularities. Each email contained nothing more than compiled information. A brief cover note stating that the enclosed material consisted solely of publicly available records presented in chronological order, and a statement encouraging independent verification. There was no flourish, no threat, no emotional language, only transparency. By sunrise the next morning, the consequences had begun to ripple outward in ways entirely predictable to anyone familiar with institutional response patterns. At 6:48 a.m., my phone vibrated repeatedly as notifications stacked over one another. Missed calls, voice messages, text messages layered with escalating panic. By 7:30 a.m., the stream became frantic, accusations flying in rapid succession, claims that I had ruined marriages, destroyed reputations, endangered livelihoods. The irony was stark, because I had not fabricated a single sentence. Every figure, every date, every document had existed long before I assembled them. I had not created vulnerability. I had illuminated it. Lauren sat across from me at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, her expression sober but steady. She watched as I scrolled through the messages without responding, and I could see the internal recalibration happening within her, the final separation between loyalty to friends and clarity about character. I told her calmly that transparency does not equal destruction, that consequences do not originate from exposure, but from conduct. Information does not ruin stable foundations. It reveals unstable ones. The panic flooding my phone was not the sound of innocence under attack. It was the sound of control slipping away from people who had relied on secrecy as insulation. I did not answer their calls. I did not retaliate further. The documentation had already reached the hands of individuals whose responsibility it was to evaluate it. Whatever unfolded from that point forward would be the product of their own histories, intersecting with accountability. Lauren remained silent for a long moment, then nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging that the 48-hour loyalty challenge had ended exactly where it was always destined to end, not in the exposure of a faithful husband, but in the unraveling of those who believed they could weaponize suspicion without consequence. Before noon, the three of them were standing on our front porch in 5 points. No coordinated smiles this time, no rehearsed moral authority, just visible panic barely contained beneath hurried makeup and rigid posture. I saw them through the front window before opening the door, Tiffany in front, as usual, shoulders squared as if she could still control the tone of the encounter, Amber slightly behind her with eyes red and unfocused, and Jenna gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles were pale. The transformation from confident arbiters of loyalty to frantic defendants had occurred in less than 12 hours the moment the door opened. Tiffany launched into accusations, her voice sharp and trembling at the edges as she claimed I had retaliated, that I had overreacted, that I had crossed a line by involving spouses and regulatory authorities. She said her husband had already contacted an attorney that morning, framing it as a threat rather than a consequence. But the strain in her expression betrayed the fact that this was no longer about intimidation. It was about damage control. Amber cut in next. Her composure fractured, admitting through clenched teeth that her spouse had accessed the education account statements at sunrise and discovered the withdrawals, the college savings fund for their 12-year-old son, nearly emptied in a sequence of transfers that were impossible to explain away as clerical error. Jenna spoke last, her voice thin and brittle, informing me that she had been suspended pending investigation by the state licensing authority and that board representatives had already requested formal statements from the physicians involved. They called it retaliation. They called it vindictive. They called it disproportionate. What they did not call it was accurate, though accuracy was precisely what unsettled them. Lauren stepped forward before I responded, and her voice carried a steadiness I had not heard all week. She held up printed screenshots of their private group chat, the messages mocking her, calling her naive, joking about how entertaining it would be to watch her face when I inevitably failed their test. She read portions aloud without raising her volume, letting the words speak for themselves. The condescension, the manipulation, the calculated orchestration of scenarios designed not to protect her, but to humiliate her. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was documented, time-stamped, undeniable. I told them calmly that retaliation implies fabrication or distortion, and that I had done neither. I had compiled public records, organized verifiable facts, and delivered them without commentary. Their own financial decisions, prescription patterns, and documented settlements had existed long before I arranged them into coherent timelines. Transparency had not created misconduct. It had illuminated it. I handed each of them a sealed envelope containing copies of the same records they had already begun confronting through their spouses and regulators, not as a threat, but as confirmation that I was not operating in secrecy or improvisation. I told them in measured terms that this would be the final interaction we would have, that any further contact would be considered harassment and addressed accordingly, and that the boundary was permanent. There would be no negotiation, no reconciliation, no reinterpretation of events. Lauren stood beside me as I spoke, not behind me, and that distinction mattered. They lingered for a moment, as if expecting reversal, but none came. The authority they once projected had evaporated, replaced by the realization that accountability feels personal when it is finally unavoidable. I closed the door without anger, without triumph, simply with finality, fully aware that the loyalty challenge they had engineered had revealed exactly what it was always destined to reveal, not weakness in my marriage, but fragility in their own foundations. Within weeks, the consequences that had begun as quiet ripples solidified into public records and formal outcomes that no amount of denial could reverse. And because everything had been rooted in documentation rather than rumor, the unraveling followed procedural timelines rather than emotional ones. Tiffany's divorce filing became publicly accessible first, a straightforward petition citing irreconcilable differences, but accompanied by financial disclosures that reflected far more strain than her curated social presence ever suggested. Her husband's attorney moved quickly, and the posture of confidence she had once carried was replaced by the unmistakable fatigue of someone forced to reconcile image with reality. The very mechanisms she once used to evaluate others were now evaluating her under oath. Amber's situation unfolded differently, but with equal gravity. The discovery of the depleted education fund for her 12-year-old son forced immediate transparency within her household, and rather than public litigation, her spouse initiated structured financial counseling and began negotiating custody adjustments tied to financial oversight. The conversations that once happened in secret browser windows and offshore betting platforms were now happening in formal offices with advisors present, spreadsheets open, and accountability imposed by necessity rather than choice. The dates that had aligned so neatly in my summary became central reference points in their negotiations, not because I emphasized them further, but because numbers rarely lose relevance once exposed. Jenna's outcome was the most institutional in nature. The state licensing authority completed its investigation within a matter of weeks, and the overlapping prescription patterns, combined with corroborating transactional evidence, resulted in the revocation of her professional certification. Suspension became termination. The physicians involved faced their own scrutiny, and the network that once relied on quiet coordination collapsed under regulatory review. Her attempts to frame the situation as misunderstanding dissipated once formal findings were issued, and the documentation she had dismissed at the Red Stein became the backbone of official determinations. Throughout those weeks, Tiffany attempted contact repeatedly, cycling through new numbers after Lauren blocked the previous ones. Messages alternating between accusation, pleading, and revisionist narratives that attempted to recast events as mutual escalation rather than deliberate orchestration. Lauren blocked each number without responding, her silence no longer uncertain but resolute. There were no dramatic confrontations, no social media exchanges, no public commentary from us. We did not need to defend what had already been verified. Meanwhile, our home returned to quiet. The tension that had hovered over us during the 48-hour challenge dissipated gradually, replaced by deliberate conversations that were private and unhurried. Lauren and I rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through consistency, shared routines, and clarity about boundaries. We did not dramatize the ordeal, we processed it. On our anniversary weekend, we drove to Charleston, checked into a historic inn near the waterfront, and spent 2 days walking cobblestone streets, eating without interruption, and sitting on the harbor watching the light change over the water. There were no staged scenarios, no suspicious glances, no phones vibrating with chaos. There was only stillness. One evening over dinner, she admitted quietly that she had underestimated how calculated people can become when projecting their own guilt onto others, how easily suspicion can be disguised as loyalty, and how confidence can mask insecurity so thoroughly that even intelligent people overlook it. She acknowledged that trust is not protected by surveillance or manipulation, but by mutual transparency and discernment about who is allowed access to your life. I did not lecture or remind her of anything. I simply listened. By the time we returned home, the marriage they had attempted to test felt steadier than before, not because it had been challenged, but because it had been clarified. 3 months later, the noise had faded into something distant and procedural, no longer an active storm, but a closed chapter whose consequences continued elsewhere without our participation. Life in Raleigh returned to its usual rhythm, mornings structured, evenings quiet, weekends intentional rather than reactive. Lauren rebuilt her social circle carefully, this time through colleagues at work and through community volunteering initiatives where shared values were demonstrated over time rather than declared loudly in curated gym selfies. I watched the way she approached new friendships with a steadier pace, less dazzled by intensity, more attentive to consistency, and she admitted more than once that she now understood why I habitually observe patterns when new individuals enter our orbit. That habit had always been part of who I am, not as suspicion, but as discipline. In compliance auditing, patterns reveal risk long before events escalate. Behavioral consistency matters. Timing matters. Discrepancies matter. I review trends in financial ledgers and regulatory filings every day, identifying vulnerabilities not through emotion, but through sequence and probability. When those 3 women believed they were conducting a 48-hour loyalty test on a husband, they assumed the framework was romantic temptation and moral resistance. They assumed the metric was whether I would respond to stage flirtation. What they did not account for was that I evaluate systems for a living, and social systems are no different from corporate ones when examined objectively. Lauren once told me she used to interpret my observational nature as detachment, but now she sees it as protection. Not control, not paranoia, but quiet pattern recognition that flags inconsistency before it metastasizes into crisis. When new people enter our circle, I do not interrogate them or investigate them covertly. I simply pay attention to alignment between words and actions, to how they speak about absent friends, to how they handle minor conflicts, to whether their self-presentation shifts depending on audience. Lauren has come to appreciate that consistency is a far stronger indicator of character than charisma. Looking back, the entire challenge revealed something fundamental about projection. They believed fidelity could be measured through temptation because temptation was the lens through which they viewed relationships. They designed metrics rooted in suspicion because suspicion was familiar to them. When you attempt to measure someone's integrity, you inevitably expose the standards you live by yourself. Every scenario they constructed reflected their assumptions, and every assumption traced back to vulnerabilities they were actively concealing. They failed every standard they attempted to impose, not because I exposed secrets that did not exist, but because their own records contradicted the moral superiority they tried to project. The challenge did not end with shouting, retaliation, or spectacle. It ended with documentation, procedure, and boundaries enforced without theatrics. I did not fight emotionally because emotion clouds assessment. I responded strategically because strategy clarifies outcomes. Integrity does not require performance when it is consistent. It simply requires steadiness when tested. 3 months later, our marriage felt less reactive and more intentional, grounded not in the absence of conflict, but in the knowledge that when conflict arises, it will be addressed with clarity rather than chaos.